It's Gabriel.
It's Bailey.
And this is CYMK.
All right, welcome to the CYMK podcast. We are here today joined by Gina Pisto, ceramic artist and visiting artist for a workshop we just had in the Concho Clay Studio. We were so excited to have her, and I got even more excited the more I looked you up and the more I saw your work and your artist statement. So gosh, we were just so excited to have you and pick your brain today.
Yes.
So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the invitation and I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. Your work is just so... I have so many questions, and I was looking more at your work this morning. I woke up and then I was I want to ask this question. And so I hope you don't mind, but
Yeah.
we want to know everything.
Of course.
3 hours later. No.
Yeah. I guess we could just start off with, if you want to talk about your art education and background and what kind of got you started as an artist.
Yeah, so I think the kind of quick and dirty with my background is I was raised in Columbus, Ohio, and I went to school for my undergraduate degree at Grand Valley State University. So I started there in 2012 and I finished in 2016 with my BFA in ceramics. After I finished undergrad, the following summer in 2017, I moved to Richmond, Virginia to do a post-baccalaureate at Virginia Commonwealth University in crafts and materials studies, but with a focus in ceramics. So I did the post-bac for about a year, then spent a year just living and working in Richmond. And then in 2019, I applied and was accepted into graduate school at Ohio University in southeastern Ohio. So I went to grad school for ceramics in 2019. Hayun and I started and finished school at the same time. So that's our connection, as we started at the same time at OU. And then graduated in spring of 2022 with my MFA. And I'm now living in Kansas City, Missouri, where I am an artist in residence at Belger Craneyard Studios, which is a communal art space, ceramic space in just east of downtown Kansas City. So I completed my first year of residency in August of this year, and I'm now in my second year as a resident after being renewed. So that's been my trajectory with education and now leaving school. Where I'm at, but I always knew that I was going to be an artist. My dad is a painter, so I grew up, in a creative household, and we always went to art museums and things when I was growing up. And my dad, had his career in software sales for about 30 years, but received his bachelor's of fine arts in painting in the 70s. And so I think it was 2006 maybe, when I was in middle school, he was always painting in the basement. He had his studio and office sort of right next to each other. And I think it was 2006, he was like, I want to start getting into galleries. I have this degree, I'm still painting, and I want to do something else now. And I think as a young person, in middle school and high school, to see my dad, who, had gotten a professional arts education, but then had this career outside of the arts, to see him consistently working and seeking opportunities and pushing his work and challenging himself, I think had a big impact on me and wanting to work hard and seeing what is possible and how you don't necessarily have to build your career around art to be a successful artist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So he set a really great example for me that I think that dedication and work ethic, has stuck with me for the last 15 or so years.
That's wonderful. Wow.
Yeah.
Gosh. So did he kind of want you to be a painter when you started getting into the arts, or was he just glad you were creating?
He was glad that I kind of got the creative bug between myself and my brother. I think he did want me to be a painter, and I wanted to be a painter. I painted throughout high school, took all the classes that I could at my high school, went to school at Grand Valley originally to be a painter and to be a high school art teacher. That was what I wanted to do, was get my BFA in painting and then get the teaching certificate. And actually throughout high school, I did not like ceramics. I took one ceramics class and it was a total disaster. I did not like it. I didn't like anything that I made.
Ugh.
I thought it was so hard. I did not think it was fun. I just didn't enjoy any part of it, other than, I guess, hanging out with my friends who were in that class,
Right.
of course. And so when I got to college, as part of an art education degree at Grand Valley and many other places, you know, you pick a concentration. So I wanted to do art ed, concentrating in painting. And you pick a concentration, but you have to, you know, take introductory courses in other areas because as a K-12 teacher, you have to be well-rounded in lots of different things. And so I took, you know, sculpture and metalsmithing and printmaking. And I took ceramics, my first ceramics class in college in 2013, because I was like, well, this is the thing that I hated the most in high school. And I know I'm going to have to teach it. And I need to be at least proficient enough that, you know, I can show, you know, high schoolers or middle schoolers or whatever how to do it. And so that's the only reason that I took the class was because I knew it was a weak point in my, I guess, artistic prowess, if you want to call it that. And I just kind of got bit by the bug. And I was still taking painting classes. And so for about a year and a half, you know, from 2013 to 2015-ish, I was thinking I was going to double major in painting and ceramics. And I just started to get kind of less interested in and less excited by painting and more excited by the challenge and the desire to just get good at ceramics because it didn't come naturally to me at all. And I thought it was so hard, but fun.
Do you do both hand building and wheel throwing, or do you strictly just do hand building? Strictly
hand building. I would say I mostly do coil building, solid construction, slab building. I was trained, you know, in undergrad on how to work on the wheel, and I teach wheel throwing to my students now. But it's not a practice or a technique that finds its way into my work at all.
Nice.
I really love just the flexibility with clay. You can do so much. You can be sculptural. You can be functional. Is that kind of what you were kind of experimenting with as you were getting bit by the bug? You were like, there's so much more here than just with painting. There's so many different options here. Yeah,
I think clay can be almost anything, you know, and the finish of it, the look of it. I mean, it can mimic so many different materials and textures. It can interact with space and gravity and the viewer, individuals, in I think some really interesting ways. And I think that was part of the excitement towards me, as opposed to thinking about painting in this like just traditional flat rectilinear format, which is how I was thinking about it at the time. But I think also the sense of community that is, I think, inextricably tied to ceramics and working with clay as a practice, you know, like because of our equipment needs and our material needs and our space needs, like you just can't help but be in a space with a lot of other people, you know, who want to be there and are excited to be there. And I think the peers that I was working alongside in undergrad, you know, had this mentality that I have seen in other schools and other spaces since, you know, where you want to be kind of open source and there's all this sharing of techniques and process and recipes and, oh, how did you do this? This is really cool. And it's like, oh, I just used this tool this way. And it's like, I never would have thought of doing that.
That's always my favorite part. I'm just like, oh, how did you do that? And I think it's going to be some fancy like diamond core $100 tool. And it's like, oh, it's my fingernail. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that's awesome.
Yeah, like, oh, it's just this piece of garbage that I found on the floor, but then I figured it would do this thing, and so now I use it.
I think Ross Grady, I had talked to him once, and I was like, "What is that?" And he's like, "That's literally from my trash can." And I was like, "Oh, that's awesome!"
Yeah,
that's so cool.
Yeah. I love that, and there's so many communities that you could be part of where gatekeeping is involved and not wanting you to know the process is involved, but the clay community here in Texas is the most welcoming, friendly group I've ever met. We went to the Texas Clay Festival and it was like...
Yeah. Maybe I'm still riding that high, but now I'm just like, oh my gosh, everyone in ceramics is so fun and awesome and cool and sweet.
Nice. Oh gosh, yeah. So I see what you mean is that community. And I mean, that's what we try to do here at the Concho Clay Studio too, is just creating community through clay is like our tagline. And gosh, it's just so fun. It's so fun. I love that. I love being part of that community, even though I'm a painter, but I like just being part of it to see it.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
So talking about your work now, you said that in your artist statement, your work kind of imitates like the in between life and death, and then you mentioned like earlier how the viewer should interact with it.
Mhm.
How should the viewer interact with your work? Like, how would you, as the artist, want the viewer to interact with it, or is it more up for the viewer's interpretation?
Well, I think always the viewer's interpretation is built into making work and putting it out there for people to see. So, I can only control what I can control, but I think that as an artist, I would say the most sort of basic, if I was going to paint the broadest stroke about my interest in the work that I make and my interest in object making, is encouraging people to just think about their relationship to what they surround themselves with. So I think that a lot of my work is sort of situated within the domestic space, or is referential to items within the domestic space. So frames and pots and baskets and lamps and textiles and, all of these different materials and objects that we keep in our home. And I'm very interested in, how do we interact with the objects around us in our life, and why do we hold on to certain things? Whether they're like tiny little tchotchkes or receipts or ticket stubs, back when you would get a physical ticket of something and not just a QR code on your phone.
Right.
Like, why do we hold on to all of these different things, and what is the sort of importance of those things that we hold on to? And so I hope that, viewers just, think about their relationship to those things, and think about the memorabilia or the mementos or the heirlooms that they hold on to when they view the work.
Awesome. On your altars, whenever you put those memorabilia on there, you create those. Are those to commemorate anyone specific from your past, or is it just more of a broad, like, just think about this one thing and this one person?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, for myself, like the seed or like the root of the work or the materials that I use or the images or the iconography that I use, of course, comes from a personal space. So, I have many, many photos from my grandparents' home, the home that I remember them living in, but also their house before, like long before I came around. And so I have like dug through all of these family archives, all these photos that my parents have in albums and books and all of that, and have spent, a couple of years scanning as many as I can of those images. And for me, both of my dad's parents have passed at this point, and it's a way for me to still find connection with them, even though they're not here anymore. And I think my interest in, people and their relationship to the objects around them stems from my grandparents, especially my grandmother. Her and my grandfather were immigrants, so they immigrated from Italy in 1950. My grandmother was 8 months pregnant with my dad when she came over on the boat. And they were very poor. They were from an extremely poor village in southern Italy, and they immigrated to the US for a better life, to pursue the American dream. And they had to work, so hard and through so many obstacles to, have a life that they could support, and how to support their two kids, my dad and his brother, my uncle. And when they worked enough to then see a degree of success, they wanted to show that through the things they surrounded themselves with in their home. So when I was growing up and we would go to my grandparents' house, like, they kind of mainly lived in the basement, and then there were these 2 other floors in their house. And I loved, as a kid, like wandering around on these 2 other floors where we really didn't hang out. Like, it was kind of like plastic over the furniture, looked like a model home, very pristine. Wow. But I loved looking in like the china cabinet and these different, very kind of kitschy, like Rococo influenced lamps that were, soft paste porcelain, like sculpted in, these sort of like dandy characters, with them these like frilly lampshade and tassels. And, everything was kind of maximalist, very ornamented, very French style of objects and decorations in their house. And, that was like status symbols for them. That was a way for them to to show that they had made it to a degree, you know, to their friends and family that came over. And I always thought that was very interesting as a kid, sort of like seeing that and seeing the contrast between this like pristine, you know, living room or sitting room in their house. And then, you know, you go down to the basement and they're coming in from the garden and their hands are dirty and they're like, you know, cleaning tomatoes to make sauce, and still very kind of rustic or, you know, very like working class people. So it was this interesting relationship, I think, between these two different identities that I saw quite often as a kid. But the value on those decorations, those like sculptures, those frames, those objects in the home was, yeah, I think of it just really interesting to me. And so I think, you know, when I'm choosing what I want to create, whether it's flower pots or baskets or frames, I'm always looking to these photographs of their home and, you know, trying to find something that sticks out to me or really reminds me of them in some way. And then that is how I choose what I want to recreate. And so when I make these altars and there's all this little like curio and these bits and flowers and, you know, whatever all over the shelf, I like to include some of the photos that I've, you know, been scanning and kind of pulling imagery from, just as a way to kind of tie it to a specific person or a specific place or a point in time without it being like, here's a photo of my grandma, you know, because I want viewers to be able to insert themselves in some way into the work. And it becomes a little bit too specific if there's, you know, photos with people in them or, you know, too much text or things like that.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a beautiful inspiration. That's great. Okay, I wanted to ask, because I was also reading through your artist statement. You talk about, you say, I reference 17th century post-Reformation era English death rituals, where life and death are viewed as a singular cultural process in order to ease the pain of loss when it inevitably presents itself. Can you tell me about some of these death rituals, or is it like you don't really want to get into that if you don't have to? But I'm curious about this part of it and where you kind of learned about this.
So a lot of the, I guess, research that I'm pulling from is from this book called The Art of Death, which is by Nigel Llewellyn. And it's a pretty short read. It's got a lot of great photos in it of, you know, different artifacts and objects and so forth from this post-Reformation era. But, you know, something that I thought was so interesting when I read it was like all of the different jewelry and the clothing that was worn by people in this era, you know, where, you know, sort of mourning was not just in these like couple of days after a person had passed, but it was this entire process that people would go through in, you know, all throughout the home and throughout, right, even like the closets, right, the accessories that people would wear. There were all of these different reminders of death. So a lot of, you know, skeletal imagery or locks of hair that were embedded in jewelry in some way, or dates, you know, that were inscribed onto things. And I think the idea of having all of these reminders of, you know, people who have passed or, you know, are no longer with us, like, I could see an argument for how that's like a little bit morbid, right? To be like surrounded by these reminders of death all the time. But I do think there's something about it that is also very beautiful, and it's a way to sort of continuously like through every day in this like everyday practice be honoring somebody else through objects, right? Like it's not just, right, I'm going to think about this, or I'm looking through these photos, but I'm going to wear this locket, or I'm going to wear this bracelet, or this certain scarf or something, you know, every single day or on a very regular basis, so that, you know, through this material or through this object, I'm like consistently kind of remembering this person, you know, in the hopes that, right, we hold on to the memory in some way, but also, you know, find comfort even when somebody we're close to does, you know, eventually inevitably pass away. There is still like, I think, a comfort in the association, you know, with what we hold on to and live with, on a regular basis.
I think that like death and loss being so hard to talk about and hard to cope with, like to make it a taboo subject to talk about or to make art about is just making it harder for ourselves when we do lose somebody. So to normalize holding that little piece of them with you as a way of mourning is great. It's beautiful, and it's hard to, I'm sure, explain to a lot of people who just don't get it, but I totally get that and I love it. It's great.
I've known a lot of people who just kind of want to throw away all of the memorabilia just to forget about the pain and get away with the grief. But there's something about embracing it and then remembering the loved ones that I feel like it can be more healing than hurting than just throwing away those objects of theirs. So
let yourself deal with it a little bit before you just push it down.
Right?
Yeah. Gosh.
So talking about your work that because you cover some of your pieces in plastic, no?
Mm-hmm.
So is that because of the way that you saw your grandparents' house in that pristine condition?
Yeah, that's a part of it, definitely. I always felt confused as a child by like these beautiful sitting rooms and beautiful front rooms in my grandparents' home, and even some of their cousins as well, their siblings whose houses we would go to, and it's like everything is so gorgeous, and then there's this plastic over the
You can't touch anything.
and it's like you can't touch
the couch.
anything, and you sit on the couch and it's squeaking and it's not comfortable, and and it's about this like preserving of a thing, but it's like I was always curious, like, why are we preserving this thing if we never actually get to enjoy it?
Right.
Like it didn't quite make a lot of sense to me. But the reason I started using plastic, I think more so than just this kind of reference to covering furniture was, I was in grad school when the pandemic hit. And in 2020, I lost access to my studio for about 4 months. And so I was at a, 2.5 by 3.5 foot kitchen table, and that was my studio. And that was sort of the best that I had. And I still had critiques and reviews, and I still had to make work, but I couldn't use clay, and I couldn't do much of anything given the spatial restrictions. But I had a lot of dried flowers that people had been bringing me that I was using to kind of sculpt from life with during my first year of school. And I had a bunch of sheet plastic because I had just collected some for, covering sculptures and whatnot. And so I started making these, people were doing like doorstep drops of like flowers, like bouquets that they had, and the flowers would start to die. And I'd be like, bring them to me and I'll find something to do with them, right? Like classic sculptor being a material hoarder. And so people were bringing me all these kind of like starting to die, starting to wilt flowers. I had a bunch of plastic. And so I was sort of thinking about how interesting it would be to create these like kind of bags, or this like sandwiching with the, like a layer of plastic, the flowers, and then a layer of plastic, and then using heat to seal and fuse together the edges of that plastic. And during the pandemic lockdown times, I got so interested in seeing the change over time as these flowers were encased in plastic, and how they would start to rot and get really like gross and sort of juicy inside the bag, and there would be brown liquid moving around, and mold would start to grow. And I thought it was so fascinating to think about this like false preservation that was happening, right? And like the plastic being this vehicle to cover the flowers and protect them in a way, but then at the same time sort of expedite their decay or expedite their destruction because there's no air circulation. It's just this buildup of condensation and moisture. And so through this desire to protect, there is this like inevitable breakdown that instead happens. And so I thought that was conceptually really interesting. And so my like love affair with plastic sort of started there, because I just got very excited about its conceptual potential as a material. And so when I finally had access to my studio once again, I was like, okay, well now how do I make these like plastic covered flower things, but also use clay, right? Because I want to like be touching clay again. I want to be using it, but I don't know how to kind of marry these materials, or I had a hard time thinking about it. And so, I went, and this is when I started also using, photos of my grandparents' house as a reference point or a jumping off point. And so I was looking at all these photos of their house and the doors and the windows and, entryways. And so I started making these kind of, I guess, like skeletal structures, right? So for example, I looked at like their front door, and there was this little window in their front door that had a certain kind of pattern, like it was a decorative window. And so I took that and sort of blew it up and built this like linear kind of skeletal sculpture out of it, and then attached a bunch of fresh flowers to it using string, and then covered the whole thing in plastic.
Are those ones colorful? So those are real flowers in there?
Yeah, so there are real flowers in there. So then I covered it in plastic, and I used a heat gun to kind of shrink the plastic to the structure. And it just became like so interesting to me about, thinking about this expedition or expediting of destruction or decay. And I think that I saw that as this metaphor for memory and like recall of memory, and how every single time we are, recalling a certain memory or a certain moment in time, we're changing it just a little bit, and so we're no longer remembering the actual thing, we're remembering the memory, and then it changes a little bit. And so there is this like inherent destruction in that recall that happens. And so I was sort of using the flowers encased in plastic as this kind of metaphor for that. So it was interesting to see how that work changed over time and got kind of like gross and moldy and gnarly.
So did you sell those pieces with the fresh flowers in them, and just explain, hey, this is going to get moldy and maybe stinky and maybe wet and gross?
I did not sell them. Most of those pieces I took apart. I like cut the plastic bag off, and then I took all the flowers out, and then I repurposed those like dried, gross, moldy flowers into other works eventually later on.
Nice.
Which was sort of interesting because there was like mold growing and like decay on these flowers in such an interesting way that it's like I couldn't make this happen if I tried.
Cool.
It's like there's a like this element of the unknown, or this like spontaneity involved with that kind of process that eventually some of those flowers were incorporated into different altars or different installations. So they looked kind of beautiful with all the mold on them.
That's pretty cool. Do you keep them? How do you preserve them long enough to put them onto another piece?
So I would, just kind of keep them to the side in my studio, or try to keep them in like some kind of container. But they're delicate, right? They're like very delicate pieces. So there is this, I think, understanding that I have that like I might keep this, and there's a point where it might just fall apart, right? And then it becomes something that I just, throw back into the earth, right? And then it biodegrades. So, there's only so much control I can exert over some of those pieces.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Does creating from such a emotionally intense space, does it become mentally draining for you as you work, or is it kind of like a catharsis where you feel better after a hard day in the studio thinking of decay and death and memory and loss, and it can be taxing, but I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I think it can be emotionally intense sometimes. I think that the construction of the work is in a lot of ways like removed enough from some of my like strong personal feelings or personal ties or background or like personal loss that it's not a thing that I fixate on necessarily when I'm working in studio. But I think to that point, like when I have a show or I am doing an installation or I'm doing something where I have to make all of these decisions about nuance, right? Like nuance in the work and like how much sort of personal information do I include and what do I exclude, and just what are the aesthetic decisions that I have to make, which those I think because the work is like so tender to me, and I have so much personal, emotional investment in it that, after doing that, it can be a little bit tough to then like go back into the studio and like start something new. And so I find that in my practice, like, I'll work on these pieces that are really involved for a period of time, or I'll be working towards a show or working towards an installation, and then I like complete the piece, or I complete the installation, or I complete the show, or whatever it might be. And then I spend a few weeks just working on something else. So then I'll just make cups, or
take a break.
I'll make, smaller sculpture, or things that are not as intense and as intimate.
Yeah.
And it allows me to kind of have a breather to do something else, keep my hands busy, and then I can, continue working in that way, or with that body of work, with like energy and vitality.
Yes. Right. Okay. That does make sense. To give yourself breaks when you need them, and get back to the work when inspiration calls.
When it comes to clay, what would you say is your preferred clay body, preferred clay firing method, underglazes, the nitty-gritties of that? What do you like?
So I mostly fire cone 6 oxidation. For preferred clay, I don't have too much of a preference. In my studio right now, I'm using a lot of cone 5 B mix, or cone 5, cone 6 B mix with grog in it. So it's like a smooth porcelaneous stoneware with very, very fine grog in it. And I like that to work with. I also am currently using a lot of paper clay. So it's a cone 10 clay body that has paper pulp in it, which lends a lot of green strength, which is really helpful for me because I make work that is kind of delicate and has some very thin pieces, and then is often varying thicknesses within one piece. So areas that are really, really thick, areas that are super, super thin. And so the paper pulp, the paper fiber that's in that clay lends a lot of strength in the drying process and in the green stage. So things don't, crack and crumble and break as they're shrinking. So those are the two clays that I use the most right now. Hyun could probably confirm that I was like the clay hoarder in grad school, and there was a little bit of a running joke that I had like 12 different clay bodies in my studio, but it's kind of true. Like I had 15 different buckets and there were 12 different clays in them. And my theory has always been to like, I just am going to use whatever is around, and I'm going to use what's free or cheap, or what somebody's getting rid of. I'll find a way to use it. And that's sort of a privilege that I have with making sculpture. I don't have to worry about some of the same consideration that functional potters have to worry about with vitrification and absorption and, all that kind of stuff. I'm looking at clays for, their aesthetic quality more than anything. But I typically spray glaze my pieces. So the flower pots that have all of these like interlocking pieces and all of these like very thin little bits and these crevices, like they're just sort of impossible to get in with a brush. Not impossible, but it takes a lot of work and a lot of time. And I'm interested in a monochromatic palette. I'm not interested in things being vivid or every single flower being a different color. Like I like a monochromatic palette. And so I spray glaze everything, usually with underglaze. Mako or Amico underglaze is what I tend to use. And I'll spray things in the spray booth, and then I will go in with a brush and touch up any areas. The sprayer is not a foolproof solution. So touch up any areas I need to touch up, and then I will typically, on the pot, if it's a flower pot, or if it's a basket, or if it's a frame, I'll use a brush to brush on glaze to whatever that kind of outer structure is, because I kind of like the contrast between, the flowers being treated in one way and then the vessel or the basket or the frame being treated in another way, and having like a matte surface and then a glossy surface. I think there's something nice about that contrast between the two.
And those big pots, they all go in as one piece, or do you assemble afterwards, or?
All as one piece.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, all as one piece. So, I've thought and I've sort of theorized quite a bit about, building them in separate pieces. But in the past year and a half, I've come up with a way of constructing them that, I very rarely have technical issues like cracking or things breaking with these pieces or warping. And so being able to just fire them as a single piece is really nice.
Kudos.
So it's like one piece per kiln, or one fire, because those are large.
Some of them are quite large. So the largest flower pot I've made is about 4 feet tall. And we have a big gas kiln at Belger, so it just got fired in there. But other pieces, just depending on the size, I can fit a few in a barrel kiln, or the gas kiln doesn't get fired all the time. It's, it really gets fired for just taller work. So, if I make something that is taller than what's able to fit in a barrel, then I'm like, okay, I need to make like some tall candle holders and make a couple other tall pieces to make it worth it to, spend the time firing the gas kiln.
Sorry. In your candle holders, are the candles themselves also ceramic, or are those black candles?
They're just wax candles.
Cool.
Yeah.
Because they match the glaze really well, especially on picture. And so I was like, I think, are they? I don't know. So,
yeah. I also saw some on, was it your Instagram, that they were light bulbs, or am I imagining that?
Yeah, I've made a couple of lamps.
That's cool. Those are cool.
Using, the sort of candelabra, candle holder as the structural framework. And then, I learned how to make a lamp last year because after I moved to Kansas City, a friend of mine was curating a show of all lighted sculpture. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll figure out how to make a lamp. Cool. And it seemed logical because I'd already been making the candle holders for about a year at that point to, figure out how to have 3 bulbs and then, sort of wire them together and plug it into the wall.
Yeah. That is so awesome.
That is awesome.
So it was a fun challenge to figure out how to do the wiring. And I was, a little nervous, right? Because you don't want to plug the thing in and then hear zzz, right? Yeah. That's not good. But it was really so fun, so fun to make and so easy to learn how to wire stuff like that.
Oh, so good.
So do you just buy all that stuff at Lowe's?
Yeah. You can, really any hardware store. I bought the sockets individually. I bought the bulbs first because I wanted to figure out what was the size of the bulb. So then I knew the size that the piece had to be.
Yeah.
And then, I bought the sockets individually, but just bought, wire by the foot, bought a cord and a plug and, the switch to turn it on. And
wow.
You just, you figure out the hot wire and the cold wire and you attach it and you
Actually, that sounds so scary.
I know. I was a little bit nervous doing it, but it was actually very easy to do. If you just know what's hot and what's cold. It's the only thing you can really mess up. So
is that just blue wire, red wire? Is that what you mean?
Like a bomb. I gotta say, there was a very helpful WikiHow article that I studied a couple times.
Thank you, WikiHow.
Send that to me.
WikiHow University.
That's great.
I think that was most. Oh, so I also wanted to ask about your exhibit, To Hold. Mm-hmm. So whenever I saw the images of that, it was really dark lit. Was that for a specific reason?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like to have things lit sort of dim. When I'm doing more installation-based work such as that, which was my, MFA thesis exhibition, I like things that are lit in sort of a dimmer way and are a little bit more moody or what you might expect, if you were in somebody's house at night. Mm-hmm. You don't have the bright fluorescence on, right? We have side lamps and things are a little bit more golden and dark. And so I like the kind of very subtle lighting. When I have full control over the lighting, I sort of prefer that. And I like the kind of moody and intimate vibe that, or atmosphere that kind of perpetuates or creates within the gallery space. So I try to have things feel as sort of cozy or homey or domestic or moody as possible
Mm-hmm.
through lighting, but then also through, the treatment of the walls,
Mm-hmm.
Having stain on them too.
Yeah, it felt very intimate. It felt like whenever I was I wasn't there, but over the computer, it felt very intimate. So
Yeah.
thank you for sharing that. That's interesting.
I guess my last question is, does your couch have plastic on it? What's your home like? Is it decorated in Rococo or?
It is not. And no plastic on my couch.
Okay, all right.
No, kind of, I like to keep my home kind of cozy and, tidy, but, I love collecting little things, and I think that's reflected in my work too, is I just love having all of these little bits and having things out and being able to see, all of the stuff.
Right.
I really enjoy and having photos everywhere. And, I'm not a minimalist by any means.
I don't know many artists that are, honestly.
Yeah.
Well, that's fun.
Yeah.
My grandpa's version of plastic, because we have family members that also have plastic, and yeah, as a kid I didn't understand, and I mean I guess you spill something perfect anyways, but his version is he gets like those towels, like bath towels, and he puts them over where your head would be and where your arms would be, so they don't leave like that impress. And I'm just like, that looks so tacky, Bobo. I call him Bobo. I was like, that looks so tacky, Grandpa. What are you doing? He's like, it's so you don't ruin the couch. And it's better than plastic, because I just take them off when people come over, and then he puts them right back on. And so, people in their ways.
I mean, I should do that too, because every time I dye my hair, I stain something in my house red.
Yeah.
So he's got an idea.
He's onto
there.
something.
Yeah, he's
so
onto something.
Maybe we should all try that out.
Yeah.
Well, do you have any advice for any sculptors or for any artists, or any advice you wish you would have had whenever you were just starting out?
I think that, the most important thing is just to make the work and to keep working. When I was an undergrad, my professor would always say, like, work makes work.
Right.
And I think that's true. And, I tell my students that, and I think about that all the time. Like, we can theorize ourselves out of making work all day long, right? We can think about the hypothetical of what we might make, and then we can convince ourselves of every single reason why we shouldn't do that, or it's a waste of time or whatever. And I think it is important to strive for success, but I also think that if you learn something, then it's not a failure. And so you're only going to learn things by just doing it. Like, you have to just do it and do it a lot. And trust that if you just keep working and you do the best that you can, that things will improve and you'll improve, and opportunities will present themselves too. But you just have to be willing to work hard for it.
Right.
And I think I was very lucky to have parents and grandparents who are really, really hard workers and instilled, I think, a really good work ethic in me. And so you have to show up to the studio. And I tell people, I tell students, because sometimes they're like, what do you do if you don't want to work? Like, what do you do when you have work that you need to do and you don't want to be in the studio? And I always tell them, I'm like, you need to show up and you need to just give it 100% for at least 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if I really don't want to be in the studio, I go anyway and I say, I'm going to try really hard for 10 minutes or 30 minutes. I'm not going to be in there just twiddling my thumbs and looking around and just staring at the table or staring at the wall. I'm going to really, really give it my absolute best for 10 minutes. And if I'm still not feeling it after 10 or 15 minutes, then I can go home. Because it's good to know when to cut your losses and rest, and then come back with, fresh eyes, fresh hands, fresh brain the next day. But usually if I give it 10 minutes, I can find a stride in it. And so I think that's a good way to just think about work and life in general for me.
Yeah.
It's really try for a few minutes, and then, my spirits are lifted and I can stay there for a few hours and get it done.
Awesome.
That's great. That's great advice.
I have one more question. Did you make your earrings?
I did make my
They're
earrings.
very cute.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I like
They are cute.
They're just colored porcelain, fired to cone 10, but I like them a lot because
Yeah.
They
you
make-
guys do that? You guys clicking.
they make a really nice noise, and they're kind of, if you're fidgety, like I'm fidgety, they're kind of nice
I've been
to
doing
fidget
so many
with.
rings the whole time.
Yeah, my fingers.
Yep.
So,
Yeah.
it would pop in my fingers. So, yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us and for
Yes.
talking with us. And Let
You've
us
been
pick your brain.
just a pleasure, and I love your work. I can't say I'm sure I could, but I love your work. I love just reading about you. I was stalking your Instagram earlier. It's great. Gosh. And I can't wait to see your show. It's going to be great.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then I'll be at the workshop tomorrow, so I'll get to see it first time.
Great. Great. Awesome. Well, yeah, I can't wait to see you there. And thank you both so much for having me and inviting me on. I really appreciate it.
Yes. Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.